Support for Lab Out Loud is provided by the National Science Teachers Association, now celebrating its 75th year of supporting science education. Find out more about what NSTA has to offer at nsta.org. You're listening to Lab Out Loud, Science for the Classroom and beyond. Today our guest is here to help us affirm and represent all students in our science classroom.
You know, you don't know who in your classroom, who in your life, who in your family is queer because they might not be telling you. And so do you want, your family, your friends, the people in your life, your students to feel comfortable and safe around you? The answer is hopefully yes. And if that's the case, then you should care about this, because even though this may seem like it's not that big of a deal, it really is.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud. I'm your co-host Dale Basler, and Brian Bartel will be joining us shortly. Our guest today is Jamie Kubiak. Jamie teaches in East Harlem at Park East High School in New York City, and he is a chemistry teacher in his 5th year. We recently learned about Jamie from the presentation he delivered at the NSTA conference in St. Louis. In episode 170 of season 11 of Lab Out Loud, we talk about Math for America. In that episode, we emphasize the importance of teaching as a true profession, and this is something I believe today's guest exemplifies. Jamie Kubiak is here first to tell us about his experience as a Math for America fellow.
Yeah, so I am in this program called Math for America, or MFA is what I'll call it for short, which is for math and science teachers in New York City, and they are in a couple other places around the country. I'm in the early career teaching fellowship, so that means that when I started the teaching fellowship, I was in my first 4 years of teaching, and it's a 4-year fellowship. They provide professional development that's led by the teachers in MFA and some outside organizations sometimes, and you get a stipend, and it's really great professional learning opportunity. I've had a lot of tremendous growth in the program since I started, and people in MFA really helped me shape my presentation at NSTA. So I was really thankful for feedback that I got and for the support that I got as well.
Well, let's talk about your presentation. I was actually in another session kind of skimming through the NSTA 19 hashtag on Twitter, and so I didn't find you in the booklet or the program or anything like that, and I just stumbled upon the screenshot of your computer, and you were putting together slides for tomorrow's presentation, and I was like, well, this looks interesting, and I don't remember Jamie, what's the exact title of your presentation?
Yeah, the title was Affirming and Representing LGBTQIA plus Students in Science Curricula.
Yeah, okay, so that immediately kind of just caught my eye. So if people are wondering, those tweets actually help, because that's the reason and so when I looked at that, I was like, oh man, I can't go to it because I was at a different session for that time. But right. You very graciously, in a follow-up tweet, said that you recorded it and that you shared the slides, and I was like, well, this is great. So on the flight home, I watched the whole presentation, and it was excellent. It certainly wasn't a replacement.
We got grounded, and Dale watched the whole thing while we were waiting on the plane before we had to deplane and drive home.
Yeah, I watched it literally sitting in O'Hare, just watching snowfall.
Oh, no.
Yeah, we were stuck, and we wound up renting a car and having to drive home because our flight got canceled.
Excuse me, who drove?
You drove. Brian drove.
Thank you.
White knuckling all the way. We picked up two... one person we sort of knew, well, it's Brian's neighbor, and then a completely...
She's been on the show too, though.
Yeah, she's been on the show. Serendipitously, we bumped into her, and then another lady who was desperately trying to get home because she got delayed in Dallas because there are tornadoes. So it was like the movie Planes, Trains, and Automobiles starting to play out. But nevertheless,
we were living that.
Yeah, nevertheless, I watched your whole video of the session. I was going to say, it definitely couldn't replace being there. Can you describe the energy in the room? Because the room looked really full.
Yeah. So as I was setting up, one of my colleagues, actually, who's an MFA as well, she was helping me set up, and we counted how many seats there were. There were 65 seats, and I ended up doing a poll, and I think she counted, so I could kind of tell how many people were there, and I think it was about 120.
Wow,
Yeah,
congratulations.
because there were people sitting and stuff I saw in the video.
In the aisle, there were people sitting in the front. There were people like standing in the back. Like, it was a jam-packed house.
So just that alone tells me something. There is demand for this topic, demand for this subject area, and probably not a lot in the NSTA program that came up. So it was the first time hitting this topic. So I think we really welcome that.
I had a lot of people who came up to me after and said, thank you so much for doing this. This is the first time I saw this particular topic at NSTA, and to be more like it. And I was like, I had to make sure that I was there. So I got a lot of really good positive feedback from people.
That's excellent.
Its availability, like, there's not as much as maybe there should be. So hopefully it started something.
Well, absolutely. And I think that, it was one of those things where, you always go through a conference and you're like, oh, I wish I would have seen that. And as Dale mentioned, he was watching this on the plane, and he would pull out his earbuds and he'd look towards me and he'd be like, oh, and Brian, and this, and then that, and then this, this was nonstop for the next 45 minutes while we were waiting to see if we're actually going to take off. But the
time flew by. Everybody else was complaining. I just went right.
That was my measure of a good presentation, is how Dale was reacting to it and prompting me to say, oh yeah, this, and this.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for watching it while you were waiting for getting deplaned and everything.
So
go ahead, Brian.
Obviously people that are listening to the show probably didn't see it. I mean, you did break 100, but we'd like to help you bring your message to our listeners here. So can you tell us a little bit about some of your advice in reaffirming that in our science curriculum?
Yeah. So I think that the biggest message that I can drive home is that you don't have to change everything you're doing and like reinvent the wheel. That some of the most affirming things that you can do for queer students is just affirming their identity and showing that you appreciate who they are in really simple ways. So some of the things that you can do that are really simple are, instead of saying, like, when you go to address your students, instead of calling them ladies and gentlemen or boys and girls, you could call them scientists or mathematicians or students or everyone, or something that doesn't reinforce the gender binary. And the gender binary is there's only male, there's only female, there's nothing in between, which isn't actually scientifically true, nor is it socially true. So that's one that is really simple to do. I think that a lot of the advice that I would give people is just to be mindful of the way that you say things to your students. So it can be as simple as not assuming things about students and being inquisitive and asking them instead of just taking your assumptions and running with them. So for instance, one thing that I do at the beginning of the school year is when you get your roster of students, generally what happens is it will say M or F next to it, and we start to make assumptions about students based on that, whether consciously or subconsciously. So one thing that I try to do is learn the name and separate it from the gender that's listed. Actually, the sex, or sometimes they're listing sex or gender, and it can be complicated. But I have students self-identify if they feel comfortable in an anonymous survey.
Yep.
So I'm asking them questions on the first day on like a front and back sheet of paper that's like, what's your name? What are your hobbies? What are you interested in? Oh, hey, what are your gender pronouns? And then I give examples. So I teach high school students, so it's really easy for them to kind of conceptualize it. But if you have elementary school students, you might have to model more like, what is a gender pronoun? Because they might not necessarily know.
Yeah. The thing that really struck me at first you did a survey kind of to get a feel for the really who was in the room, what do you teach, what level, and you did that through like some online digital polling software or something like that, and I was like, okay. And then you did the next section was a series of questions like stand or raise your hand if you and then you said the scenarios, and I thought, well, gosh, why didn't you just use the same software? And maybe I'm wrong, but it felt like afterwards, like while I was watching it, I'm like, oh, it was about that kind of shared experience. Is that what your intent was? You were asking questions like, have you ever, I think, heard slurs, for example? Have you ever, or does your school address LGBTQ needs in its curriculum, things like that? It was really, I don't know, the action of seeing people like have to physically move their body seemed to be a powerful thing. Was that intended?
Yes. So this was advice that I got from one of the staff members at Math for America as I was planning my session. So I had the idea of the direct poll, which was the software that I used to do like, what do you teach? Like, where's your school kind of at? Because I thought that was like a nice like technology visual sort of thing. But I really wanted to build empathy for participants in the session. So because my assumption is that everyone came and they may have been at different levels of understanding on the topic. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't want to just assume that everyone knew a bunch of things or didn't know a bunch of things. So I wanted to have participants actually think about these things and think about the impact of this work, and putting themselves in the shoes of our students or in the shoes of queer people. Because a lot of the statements that I would read were stuff like, stand up or raise your hand if you've ever been told you act, quote, too girly or, quote, too manly, stuff like that. So I wanted to really build empathy, and I felt that that was a really powerful way to do it.
Mm-hmm. I liked how you hit all kinds of different topics, but you know, it really kind of struck a chord with the curricular ones. It being a science teacher conference, it kind of made sense. But you gave examples about and really got people thinking about things like masculinity in our, you know, curriculum, in our materials that we use, the choices for ways that we can include people, even in our examples. You had some chemistry examples that you use yourself.
Yeah. So, for instance, you might think, and a lot of people, myself included, have had this misconception that it's really hard to incorporate some of these things in your class and in your curriculum, when in fact it can be really easy. Sometimes you just have to take little steps to do it. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, as a chemistry teacher, when we talk about like the visible light spectrum, I talk about, well, what is a spectrum? A spectrum means that there's two ends to it and that there are values that can be in the middle, kind of like a number line. And then we start talking about, well, what's the gender spectrum? And some of my kids at my school have like done work with this in other classes. So I try to bring it to that so that they can make the connection to like social constructs and chemistry constructs. So it's just about being creative in how you infuse it in your curriculum. It doesn't have to be like a steadfast, like, oh, this is, you know, 100% in my curriculum. Like, you can be creative with it.
When I taught physical science, we would do like mixtures, heterogeneous mixtures, homogeneous mixtures. Yeah. And I remember, and I don't know what point in my career, you know, it was 21 years ago starting, but at some point when I was teaching physical science, I kind of leaned into those prefixes. And I mean, partly I would just say, you know, for the kids, they were learning the term like homogeneous, heterogeneous, and like how to, you know, that was something they had to distinguish on a test or something like that. Yeah. And I would say, you know, like heterosexual and homosexual. And I remember like, it's funny to watch it like over time, like introducing that at first, you could have people like, wow, I can't believe you said that. I mean, like I said, we're talking possibly 15 years ago. And then that kind of dwindled as you just kind of didn't make a big deal out of it. Now, I think ultimately my motivation was to not make a big deal out of words like that. But the other thing is, honestly, it was probably the most realistic example of those prefixes that they've had already. Right. Mm-hmm. And so it was like, they're going to remember this because this is a term that they know already. So it was like, so it's things like that. Like, don't shy away from it. You know, in my case, it was a memory term, but you kind of cemented in my mind, well, this is also a way to be inclusive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the more that you use it as an example and that the way that you present it is just normal and everyday, that goes really far to show not just queer students, but non-queer students, like, hey, homosexual is like a normal thing. It's cool.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I'm thinking of in my head is, you mentioned that you allow students to self-identify in their gender, and that also might come with it that their name might change along with it compared to what the official school record might have in the student information system. How do you deal with that, or what would you say to a teacher who refuses to address a student in the way they'd like to be addressed?
So in New York specifically, there are a lot of protections for students around their gender identity and their name that they are choosing versus their legal name. And as someone who is cisgender, so as we don't know, cisgender means that the sex that I was assigned at birth matches my gender identity. So I was born a male and I identify as a male. So I am cisgender.
Cis,
CIS.
CIS.
Yep. Okay.
Which is the opposite, quote unquote, opposite is transgender, which means that the sex that you were assigned at birth does not match your gender identity. And so obviously that's another way that you can bring in, like if you're a chemistry teacher, and maybe this is upper level chemistry, but cis and trans isomers, talking about things being on the same side of a molecule versus being on the opposite side of a molecule.
Yeah, you said that in the presentation, and I knew what cis and trans for people were, but I didn't know what the isomer part was. I was like, well, oh, what's that?
Well, trans fat helped a lot with that. So, I mean, that brought it into the lexicon,
I didn't even make that
a little
connection.
bit more clearly.
Mm-hmm. What would be cis fat then?
It has to do with the orientation of the carbon structure around the double bond, but never mind, Dale.
Okay.
Anyway, I went off on a tangent, but
this is our organic chemistry. But anyway, yes, please go on, Jamie.
So, as a cis person, I actually have an experience where my legal name is different than the name that I go by. And I've actually always gone by Jamie, but even with my parents, my whole family, everyone. So I actually, session, when I found out that I was going to get to present in like October, November, they had it listed as my legal name, and it's still listed as my legal name on the website. Mm-hmm. I reached out to them and I said, could you please change it so that in the program it's Jamie? And I never got a response. And so, me as a cis person, I have a lot of privilege in that sense, but I can only imagine what a trans person might feel who must just get the name that they are going by instead of the legal name, how dysphoric that might feel. So I say this because my own experience has helped me to empathize in that way with any trans or gender nonconforming students that I might have. And the best thing I can say is to a teacher, if you don't feel comfortable using a student's name that isn't matching what's on your records, stop for a second and think, what might the student be going through? Can I set my feelings aside and do something that will make my student have a better experience? Because if I can do that, then it should be about the student. And sometimes we have to set aside our biases and our uncomfortability to make students a little more comfortable.
Mm-hmm. I think in some ways it's interesting because we've seen this evolution in technology even. Yeah. Because some of the early student information systems didn't allow for this. And it was only recently that one of the systems we use allows for a nickname.
Well, now it's preferred name actually, which is even better because...
Correct. And so that we've seen some of these systems evolve over time to allow for some of that, which you can't hide behind the software, I guess, if that makes sense, where that was a convenience before and now we don't have to rely on that.
I had a student who transitioned. I had the student twice, pre and post. And that was a challenge because in my mind I had, 1 year's name and then the following year a different name. So it took that took a little bit of time. But that was also a big challenge. I mean, it was easy. It was nothing compared to the challenge the student was going through. And so that made my vigilance much more worth it. But the whole computer thing was actually back then an issue because the system just didn't accommodate that. So you were constantly having that in your face. If there was a substitute and they get a a roster, it's going to spit out the incorrect name.
Yeah.
And all kinds of, there's so many little system-wide things that can make those little cuts like that. It is getting better, but it's little coding things that it really speaks to when we talk about STEM careers having diversity in them. And this is what we're talking about. These systems that are created in these STEM fields that
have unconscious bias.
They're not, it's not being addressed because it's not a person in the room
sometimes
building
conscious.
it.
You're right.
Yeah, that's true.
A lot of systems are in place to actually, marginalize certain groups, especially the trans community. So, but I would say about your student that you had, I think it's great that, even though it might have been difficult, you realize that like, hey, what my student's going through actually is probably worse than what I'm going through. So you kind of can put your ego aside and,
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, my like mental juggling I had to do was nothing, in comparison.
And I think that the other important thing to mention is that, we are human, we're fallible. And if we make a mistake, we just have to apologize, not make a big deal of it, move on and be better. And I think that ultimately that's going to be best for the kid.
Yeah, that was a big thing you kind of emphasized in your presentation too. Like, I don't have all the answers, but here are some resources to get the answers. And you also, I felt, even though I was watching it on an airplane, I felt like a connection there when you said, I make mistakes at this also just as much as, and I'm doing a presentation on it, but I make mistakes, but you can, correct it and recover from those mistakes. And how about some of the resources that you shared? Is there, if we have listeners saying, okay, I want to do more with this, is there a good recommendation of a, jumping off point?
Yes, absolutely.
Besides the video of your presentation, of course, which we will put in the show notes.
Oh, awesome. So in there, you can find some of the resources that I mentioned. One of the best ones is GLSEN, GLSEN. If I'm not mistaken, it stands for Gay and Lesbian Student Education Network. Mm-hmm. It has a lot of really good resources around curriculum and gender terminology and like all of this kind of stuff that would help people at different levels of understanding. Another really good one is, it's not really so much a resource so much as like just a really awesome thing that's happening. It's called 500 Queer Scientists.
Yes.
I believe they have a website, they have a Twitter, and I guess they have an Instagram. And all of those people are gorgeous, and I just want to meet all of them.
Mm-hmm. And, weren't there some famous, Brian, you were looking at it with Marsha, weren't there?
I may have looked in a different website. I just kind of Googled that and I found like Margaret Mead. One of the things that I struggled with early in my career was trying to find diverse scientists. And at that time I was thinking probably more in terms of like where the African American, where the women, we're portraying a lot of, white European dudes here. Mm-hmm. And it basically what the realization was to me, it was that, my schooling and experience had driven me towards most of that versus it's not that they're not out there. It's just, you didn't have the resources to understand where they were. And I think that's an important piece there to say, like, oh yeah, there's an awareness of, yes, that these are important scientists no matter what walk of life they have and where they are and where they're from and whatnot. And that I love the fact that we have a resource where we can go for that.
Yeah. And I think that you kind of made the point that like all of us are growing up in the system where everything is like Eurocentric, it's straight centric, it's white centric, it's very, the majority, and it leaves out a lot of groups of people who are doing some really awesome and amazing things and have done all throughout history.
One of the things I'm trying to think about beyond the chemistry classroom, but also probably in chemistry or physical science or whatnot, but maybe down in middle school science. What are some, maybe is the term heteronormative practices that we've seen where, and what I'm thinking of is, I'm going to make sure that the boys have a blue folder and the girls have a, and I'm going to make sure that you're going to be lab partners, a boy and a girl kind of thing. Are there things out there that are, and again, a lot of these are unconscious, but what are some practices that you see that we should be looking out for and maybe taking a moment to pause and reflect and say, I can do this better?
Yeah, I think that especially in like our health and biology curricula, a lot of what's happening is it's very like heterosexual and heteronormative.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about, boys have a penis and girls have a vagina, and that's it. And that's just not true. Obviously, most people who have a penis are male, and maybe, that might even be the wrong generalization. But just because you are male doesn't mean you have a penis. And just because you have a penis doesn't mean you're male.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that a lot of the health curriculum focuses on assigning gender to the parts versus just talking about the parts.
Mm-hmm.
About the parts, then sure, we can talk about, pregnancy and how systems work, but it also kind of leaves out, intersex and what's happening when it's not just XX and XY chromosomes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the biggest perpetrators of this heteronormative thing happen in that sense.
Yeah. Well, as I think about that when I taught biology, and actually it was like every 4 years when the Olympics would roll around, that identity of what sex is came, usually into focus. And we could talk a little bit about the biology of sex there too. But now, as you're saying, what is the social alignment of sex, I think is an important addition there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think that, at one of the sessions I went to at NSTA was done by HHMI. Biointeractive. I forget what the HH stands for.
Howard Hughes Medical Institute.
There we go. Okay. So they were talking about the biology of race and the biology of sex. And so we were talking about, I forget the person's name, but we were talking about sex testing that they've done in sports and just sports in general, and how some of the tests have been used to, really, they were only doing them on women.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Doing it to prove that you are a woman or aren't a woman and who could compete in what.
And to humiliate and marginalize, as you mentioned.
Absolutely. So I just thought that was super interesting that I didn't know about that. And of course, that's because our system isn't teaching us those things.
The podcast Radio Lab just had an arc a few months ago on sex, basically, and they talk about some of those, which are fascinating so that's definitely a great listen as a teacher, wondering about the identity of sex biologically, but also socially.
Jim Jeffries' show, now he's a comedian and crass sometimes, but still, I think he's trying to address some strong issues. He just had a show about that too, the hurdles in athletics that trans athletes have to go through.
Yeah,
and it was really good, actually. I had a thought. I have lots of thoughts.
I'm thinking about this because when we went over genetic disorders, for instance, in biology, I was often cautious to make sure that no one was made an example of in the class. And this often came about. I mean, you almost always had a student with red-green color blindness. Mm-hmm. And they often, self-approached, the class and said, I'm red-green color blindness. And, but how do you avoid it becoming like something to look at and go, oh my gosh, this is like something,
the trophy gay or the trophy trans.
Correct.
Person.
Yeah. And we had issues of certain genetic disorders that every now and then cropped up, and I didn't want it to be again making an example of that student.
Right. And I think that's a really good point. Something I hadn't thought of until the second, but I guess my thought would be, if you just talk about it in general terms instead of pointing at specific students, you could now, for instance, you were going to talk about some of the chromosomal differences in particular athletes that have been sex affected. I think you could use those as examples instead of students in your class, because you definitely don't want to out a student. You don't want to use them as an example or other them in any way that won't, make them feel comfortable in class. But talking about the topic and talking about the issues in a general sense and being specific about it without naming, if you let's say, you have a trans student in your class, instead of being well, student A over here, you wouldn't want to single them out.
Yeah. Why don't you tell the class about it?
Tell us about your hemophilia.
Yeah, you'd be like, yeah, exactly.
Because you don't want, one of the worst things that you can do is make like someone in a marginalized group explain like their marginalization. Like I always say is that, you know, a lot of issues come up and I'm always like, well, you know, me as the gay teacher, I shouldn't always be the one that has to deal with it. Sometimes I have that energy to do it, like with this presentation and talking to you all. But sometimes I just don't have that energy. And sometimes it would be really great if straight allies, you know, came up and were doing. And so I always say, you know, you wouldn't want to ask a Black student to explain why racism is bad. Like that would just be super uncomfortable. So in the same way, we wouldn't want like queer students to have to explain these topics necessarily.
I have a similar example. I just had this conversation with my son. All three of my children are adopted. And in biology class, and pretty much every class since kindergarten, comes up with the family tree. So we do the family tree again. And I'm like, geez, like he's a freshman and we're having the family tree talk about what are you going to do here? And that's one of those cases where are you thinking about everybody's situation in class? And all three of my kids have been the kid under the microscope in essence to like basically explain it to everybody else. And you know, it's uncomfortable. Why should they have to do that?
Right. Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah. I was thinking about as a physics teacher, and you did mention this in your presentation too. Physics has a history of, well, a lot of the problems for a long time were very, I guess, you know, they were always weapons and they still are sometimes. And, you know, they're cars and trucks and rah, 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 you know, and, there was, and I don't remember the author, but they worked on trying to change that in some of the textbooks and trying to make them make problems that don't always have to be kind of the same kind of, you know, action film that they are. Right. But the other thing is just designing word problems. And you talked about, you know, when you have word problems and if it presents the opportunity to have a couple in your word problem, be more inclusive there. You don't have to just, you know, slide right into those, you know, what do you call them? Heteronormative. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a really easy thing to do that like happens a lot in like math classes and physics classes too, because physics is pretty mathy, but, the best advice I can give is just either use unisex names if like you're looking for a transition into it, or just, you know, you could, you know, just be mindful about the names that you put as people that are being couples, especially like in biology, all the like Punnett squares and stuff, you know, you start to be like, well, the mom and the dad. And, and yes, that is true. That's how it works. But you want to, you know, maybe you talk about people instead of it being people, you could do like, I don't know, people are trying to like a gay couple is trying to like get the best plants or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like a book needs to be like the heteronormative Punnett square and other things that we can improve in biology education. You know, but
well, and I think
there's so many things in my mind going through thinking about what I could do differently going back into the classroom right now. And
to be clear, I don't think you're advocating that we go through and scrub everything out. It's about swapping out so there's a little more fairness, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's the thing is that it's about equity. It's not about equality necessarily because you know, it can't be equal for everyone. It needs to be fair and equitable for everyone. And I think that that's an important distinction to make. So yeah,
I know you addressed, sorry, go ahead.
I'm definitely not advocating that you go and scrap everything you've ever done, because that would just be overwhelming.
Find and replace, name list.
Yeah, absolutely.
However, I think it is good practice for us to think about what we constantly dredge up every year and may have done that for the last decade plus.
Yeah.
And some of it might need a little spring cleaning. We might need to update some of the names, some of the situations and other things like that. And that is a good time for us to pause and reflect and say, hey, can I update this unit? Can I look at other things and go from there?
You know, if you're doing it just to do it because like you feel like it's some obligation, like that's probably not the best mindset. But if you're being authentic and you're evaluating what you currently do and what you could do a little better, I think that that's really powerful.
I also think about it in a way that, and Dale and I are instructional coaches, that I want to model to other teachers that this is something that is normal. This is something that we need to look for in providing equity across all of our students too.
Yeah, and everyone as a student, if you think back, you wanted to feel safe and comfortable in your classroom. Mm-hmm. And so, anything that your teacher can do to make as many students as possible feel comfortable and safe and thrive in their classroom, that's what I'm going to advocate for every single day.
Bingo.
One thing, and Jamie, when you gave the presentation, and I know you talked about this a little bit, I'd love to continue that conversation right now. What do you say to the teacher that says, this is such a small percentage of the population, or this is non-existent in my community? Why are we even having this conversation or talking about it?
Yeah, so I will say that in conversations I've had with real teachers in various communities that I'm a part of, as I've brought up a lot of these issues, I've had people say, well, we actually don't need to worry about this because we don't have trans kids, or I don't teach trans kids, or I don't, it's such a small percent, like you said.
I don't teach trans kids. Yeah, that's the point I'm trying to make.
Right, because you do, and the reason that you quote unquote don't teach trans kids is because you're saying I don't teach trans kids, so they don't feel comfortable to be out to you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One of the most striking, I gave these statistics in my presentation. The GLSEN, I think it was GLSEN. No, It was Human Rights Campaign, HRC. They did a survey of 10,000 LGBTQ teens in 2012, and 91% of them are out to their closest friends, 64% of them are out to their classmates, and 38% of them are out to their teachers. So I thought that was a huge discrepancy.
I really wasn't kidding about the plain stuff. I dug deeper because I was parked. I found updated stuff to that. They have new numbers, and now they included just different ways to slice it. And they also have, I think it's like, I don't remember the exact term, but it was a sort of like, are you out, who you're out to? And it was like, yes, no. And then in between, it was like, they had a term for like in between, like or mixed or something, like, not fully out. And that was really informative. I thought that was excellent. But I liked when you did that in the room, most people said parents for the last number. Everybody's like, and what do you think the last number is? And it was parents. And then you said no, teachers, and there was like a gasp in the room.
Yeah, because we often think about oh, our students are always sharing things with us, but are they really?
Yeah.
Are they sharing that they feel most vulnerable about? And so going back to what would I say to teachers is that you don't know who in your classroom, who in your life, who in your family is queer. Because they might not be telling you. And so do you want, your family, your friends, the people in your life, your students to feel comfortable and safe around you? Mm-hmm. The answer is hopefully yes. And if that's the case, then you should care about this, because even though this may seem like it's not that big of a deal, it really is. And one of the points that I drove home in my presentation was that especially for trans girls of color, the trans women of color, the mortality rate is just so high that their life expectancy for a trans Black woman is 30 years old or 33, somewhere in there. It's just striking that literally queer lives are on the line, and so we should care about this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Jamie, thank you so much for your time. And we look forward to sharing these resources with everyone out there. We hope that all of our listeners take this to heart and pause and reflect a little bit in your practices in your science classroom and beyond.
And an opportunity to get more presentations like this at sessions. I think it not being available as a session at NSTA is maybe more about, well, I'm going to a science session. It's got to be sciencey, right?
Right.
And we forget we kind of focus we focus on the exhibit hall, right? The stuff and the things like that. And, it's like, let's not forget primary goal, all the students in our classroom. Right.
Exactly. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. And if I could give a quick plug for following me on Instagram and Twitter at Kubiak Chemistry. That's Kubiak Chemistry. And also, me and my partner have our own podcast. It is called Just Whatever with Jamie and Caleb.
What's it called?
Just Whatever with Jamie and Caleb. So you can find us on social media at Just Whatever Pod.
Cool.
Excellent.
Yeah, we just started like 3 months ago. So.
Oh, fantastic.
It's another podcast crossover, because we had a couple of people that came to our session, and there's someone who might be on the show in the future. They do a podcast about Disney and it like intersecting with the classroom, and I was like, well, this is amazing. It was really
saw your session on the list. I can't remember why I didn't make it, but I was like, oh, I should go to that. And
So well, thanks so much for taking the time.
Yeah, there's a lot I'd have more questions about, but I know you need to go. But thank you so much again for your time, and I really appreciate you sharing your insight into this.
Absolutely. And if anyone who's listening has questions, like, you can reach out to me on Twitter or Instagram or whatever. I'd love to chat with you.
Thanks much.
Thank you, Jamie.
Yeah, thank you.
If you'd like to learn more about today's episode, head on over to our website, laboutloud.com, for more information. You can also find details about all the previous episodes, and you can leave us feedback and comments. We want to hear from you.
If you enjoyed the show, make sure you've subscribed on iTunes, Google Play Music, or your favorite podcasting platform. And if you really enjoyed it, consider leaving us a rating or a review. Your feedback helps others find our show.
If you like Lab Out Loud and you love the show that we provide for you, please consider supporting the show at our Patreon page. Head on over to patreon.com/laboutloud for more information. Until next time, I'm Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.